I'm Ren. I'm 34, and 22 years ago, at a county fair, I got separated from my family for 6 hours as a 12-year-old. When my parents finally came to get me the next morning, exhausted from an entirely different emergency, my father's exact words were, "You're 12, Ren. It's time you grew up and learned to find your own way home. We can't be everywhere at once." I didn't speak to either of them again, in any real way, for the rest of their lives. I want to tell you what happened 3 weeks ago, when a phone call from a brother I barely knew as an adult pulled me back into a family I'd spent 2 decades deliberately staying away from. It involves an insurance policy nobody ever told me still existed, a box of letters my mother wrote and never sent, an uncle who'd quietly been managing my brother's finances in ways nobody was supposed to look at too closely, and a version of the story I'd told myself for 22 years that turned out to be only half true. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the ones who were told to grow up too fast usually turn out to be the ones holding everything together in the end. If you've ever had to raise yourself inside a family that was too distracted to notice, stay with me until the end. Drop a comment and let me know you're here. My brother Sam was born when I was 9, and by the time I was 11, our family's entire orbit had rearranged itself around his diagnosis, a progressive muscular condition that meant hospital stays, specialists 3 states over, medical bills that ate every spare dollar and every spare hour our parents had. I don't say any of this to blame Sam. None of what happened to me was his fault, and I understood that even as a kid, in the confused, half-formed way children understand things that are too big for them. What I didn't understand yet, at 11, was how completely a family can reorganize its love around one child's emergency without ever quite noticing what it's quietly withdrawing from the other one. My parents, Gerald and Louise Duran, weren't cruel people in any way I could have pointed to before that year. They were overwhelmed, stretched thin in every direction, running on the specific exhaustion that comes from loving a sick child fiercely while trying to hold down jobs and a mortgage and everything else a family needs to survive. I understood the shape of their exhaustion. I just didn't understand yet that I was going to be the one absorbing the cost of it. I remember, in the years just before all of this, being a fairly ordinary kid, decent grades, a small circle of friends, a particular fondness for the county fair that came around every September, the one predictable, joyful fixture of an otherwise unremarkable childhood. I bring that up because I think it matters, going into what happened next, that I wasn't already a difficult or attention-seeking child, looking for a reason to feel wronged. I was just a kid who loved her family in the uncomplicated way kids do, before they learn there are limits to how much of that love gets returned. The county fair happened. The September turned 12, one of the rare full family outings we still managed to take together that year. I remember it as genuinely happy at first. Funnel cake. The Ferris wheel, Sam laughing in a way his condition didn't always let him laugh easily. Somewhere around dusk, Sam had a seizure near the livestock barns, sudden and frightening enough that my parents scooped him up and ran for the car before I fully understood what was happening. I was 40 feet away, waiting in line for a ring toss game. By the time I turned around, they were gone. I remember the specific, disorienting confusion of that first moment more clearly than almost anything else from that whole night, darting around, expecting to see my family exactly where I left them, and instead finding an ordinary crowd of strangers, none of them mine, the space where my parents and brother had been standing just simply empty. I assumed, for the first 20 minutes or so, that they'd wandered off to another booth nearby and would circle back any moment. I stood near the ring toss game for a long time, watching the crowd for familiar faces, before the particular creeping realization set in that whatever had happened, it wasn't a simple case of getting briefly separated in the crowd. I want to be honest about what those 6 hours actually felt like, because I think it's the part of this story people understand the least from the outside. I wasn't lost in the sense of not knowing where I was. I knew exactly where I was, at a county fair I'd been to every year of my life. I was lost in the much larger sense of realizing, slowly, as the sky went from dusk to full dark, and nobody came back for me, that my family had left without me, and hadn't yet noticed. A fair employee running a game booth eventually found me sitting on an overturned bucket near the exit gates, close to tears, but trying hard not to show it, and let me use the booth's landline to call home. Nobody answered. I called 4 more times over the next hour. Nobody answered any of those either. Dot, running the booth, let me sit behind the counter with her, rather than out front, where I'd have been visible, and I think she understood even then, more frightened by being looked at. She kept up a steady, kind stream of ordinary conversation, asking about school, about what grade I was starting that fall, small talk, clearly designed to keep my mind from spiraling too far into the growing dark outside. I remember being grateful for it even as a scared 12-year-old, and grateful for it even more, looking back now, understanding how easily that whole night could have gone very differently without a stranger deciding on her own time to make sure I wasn't sitting alone in the dark. The fair employee, a kind older woman named Dot who ran the ring toss booth, ended up driving me to my aunt's house herself once the fairgrounds started closing down for the night, since she couldn't in good conscience leave a 12-year-old sitting alone in an empty parking lot. My aunt, surprised and a little frantic herself, finally reached my mother around midnight, learning only then that Sam had been rushed by ambulance from the fairgrounds directly to a children's hospital 40 minutes away, and that, in the chaos of that emergency, both my parents had genuinely, completely forgotten I existed until my aunt's call. I stayed up most of that night on my aunt's couch, not quite able to sleep, replaying the evening over and over, trying to understand how something like that could actually happen to a person. Sat with me for a while, offered what comfort she could, though I could tell, even at 12, that she was as unsettled by the whole situation as I was, unsure how to explain her own brother's household to a niece who deserved a better explanation than everyone was scared and it happened fast. She made me hot chocolate I didn't really want, and let me leave the hallway light on, small kindnesses that stood out sharply against the larger, harder-to-name absence sitting underneath everything else that night. My parents picked me up from my aunt's house the next afternoon, having spent the entire night at the hospital with Sam, who was stable by then, but still under observation. I remember running toward my mother's car, relieved and scared and desperate for some acknowledgement of what the night before had actually been like for me. What I got instead, standing in my aunt's driveway, was my father's voice, flat with exhaustion and something colder. Underneath the exhaustion, "You're 12, Ren. It's time you grew up and learned to find your own way home. We can't be everywhere at once." My mother didn't correct him. She didn't say anything at all, actually, just stared out the passenger window like the conversation required all her remaining energy just to sit through. My aunt, standing a few feet behind me on her own porch, started to say something in my defense, some version of, "She was terrified, Gerald. This isn't about her growing up." I remember the shape of the sentence starting, her voice rising slightly. My father cut her off before she finished, saying only, "We don't have the bandwidth for this right now, not with Sam still in observation," and my aunt went quiet, the way adults sometimes go quiet in front of children, even when they clearly want to keep arguing. I understood, watching that exchange from the back seat, that whatever had happened to me the night before was going to become a real conversation in that house. It was simply going to become something we didn't talk about, filed away the way our family apparently filed away anything too difficult to sit with directly. I didn't cry in front of them that day, which felt, even at 12, like the first genuinely deliberate decision of my life. I climbed into the back seat, buckled my seatbelt, and understood, somewhere underneath the hurt, that whatever I'd been hoping for from that reunion wasn't coming, not that day and probably not ever. I spent the drive home staring out my own window, making a private, wordless promise to myself that I would never again let my safety depend on anyone else remembering I existed. I kept that promise for the next 22 years with an efficiency that occasionally scared even me. I didn't understand, at 12, how completely that one afternoon would end up organizing the rest of my adolescence. I just knew, sitting in that back seat, that something fundamental had shifted between me and the two people in the front. Not hatred exactly. I don't think I was capable at 12 of the kind of clean, uncomplicated anger that word implies. It was quieter and more permanent than that, closer to a kind of calculation. If I couldn't count on being remembered, I would simply have to become someone who never needed remembering in the first place. Looking back as an adult, I can see how thoroughly that calculation shaped nearly every choice I made for the next 2 decades, long after the actual danger it was designed to protect me from had passed. The years between 12 and 18 were quieter than that day, but built entirely on its foundation. I learned to make my own doctor's appointments, manage my own school paperwork, get myself to and from everywhere I needed to be, treating my own independence less like a skill and more like a shield I'd built out of necessity. My parents weren't actively cruel during those years, mostly just perpetually elsewhere, their attention permanently allocated to whichever crisis Sam's condition was producing that particular month. I left for college the day I turned 18 and never really came back, not in any way that counted. Holiday calls got shorter, then rarer, then stopped entirely somewhere around my mid-20s, a slow fade neither of us ever formally acknowledged out loud. I built a career in insurance claims adjusting, of all things a job I chose partly by accident, and partly I understand now looking back, because there was something quietly satisfying about a profession built entirely around determining, with clear documentation, exactly what people were owed and exactly who was responsible for owing it to them. I was good at it, methodical in a way that occasionally unsettled coworkers who wanted answers softened a little more than I tended to soften them. I built a stable, orderly life around that same methodical instinct. A small apartment I loved, a handful of close friends I chose carefully and kept for years, a long-term partner named Ellis who understood, without my ever having to fully explain it, that certain topics simply lived behind a closed door in our relationship, and that I'd let him in eventually on my own timeline if I ever chose to at all. 3 weeks ago, a text arrived from a number I didn't recognize. "Ren, it's Sam. I know it's been forever. Mom and Dad died in a car accident 6 weeks ago. I've been trying to figure out how to reach you. There's some paperwork with your name on it I don't understand, and I didn't know who else to ask." I read that message probably a dozen times standing in my kitchen, feeling almost nothing at first. The specific numbness of grief for people you'd already grieved, in a way years earlier when you decided to stop speaking to them. Ellis found me still standing there 20 minutes later, phone still in my hand, and asked, gently, what was wrong. I read him the text out loud, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, and watched him carefully set down what he was holding, and give me his full attention in the specific way he does, when he understands a moment matters more than it might initially look like from me outside. "You don't have to respond tonight," he said. "You don't have to respond at all, if you don't want to." I told him I knew that. I also told him, surprising myself a little as I said it, that some part of me actually wanted to. I called Sam back that same night, mostly out of some instinct I couldn't fully name, somewhere between obligation and genuine curiosity about the brother I'd barely known as an adult. He was 25 now, living semi-independently with part-time caregiver support, his voice careful and a little guarded, clearly bracing for me to hang up before he finished explaining himself. He told me about the accident, a highway collision, both our parents gone instantly, no drawn-out hospital vigil this time, just an ending as sudden as it was final. He apologized, more than once, for reaching out about paperwork stuff so soon after the funeral, admitting he felt guilty even asking, but that he genuinely didn't know where else to turn. We talked for almost an hour that first call, careful and a little formal with each other at first, the particular caution of two people who share a childhood but not much else anymore. He told me about his life now, a part-time job he loved at a community center, a caregiver named Priscilla who'd been with him for 3 years, and had become, in his words, basically family at this point. I told him a little about mine, the job, Ellis, the apartment, offering it the way you offer small pieces of yourself to someone you're not yet sure deserves the bigger ones. Near the end of the call, he said, quietly, "I always wondered if you hated me, for taking up all the space, when we were kids." I told him, as honestly as I could manage, that I'd never once hated him, not for a single day, and that whatever I'd been carrying all these years had never actually been about him at all. I agreed to meet him the following weekend, more out of curiosity about the paperwork than any real emotional readiness to reopen a relationship with the family I'd spent 2 decades keeping firmly closed. Sam met me at a coffee shop halfway between our two cities, and seeing him as an adult was its own quiet shock. The same eyes I remembered from childhood, but a grown man now, careful and a little formal with me in the specific way people are formal with someone they're not sure still wants them in their life. He'd brought a small cardboard box of our father's paperwork, mostly bills and old tax documents, but tucked near the bottom was a life insurance policy, decades old, with my full name listed as both owner and primary beneficiary. Sitting across from him in that coffee shop, watching him carefully unpack the box, I found myself studying his face for traces of the toddler I remembered, the 9-year age gap between us meaning I'd mostly known him as a small child before I left. He had our father's jawline and, disconcertingly, our mother's exact way of tilting his head slightly when he was concentrating on something. "I don't really remember much before I was maybe 7 or 8, he admitted, noticing me watching him. "Most of what I know about you growing up is just like second-hand stuff Mom and Dad mentioned every so often. I always wanted to ask you more, but it felt like a subject that was sort of off-limits in our house." I told him that made sense, more sense than he probably realized, and that I was hoping we might finally get to fill in some of those blanks properly, on our own terms this time. I stared at that policy a long moment, genuinely confused. Sam explained, hesitant, that our parents had always told him the policy was meant for his care eventually, something they'd purchased years ago, and mentioned occasionally without ever fully explaining the details. He'd assumed, he admitted, that it must have been retitled into his name at some point, or that I'd have to sign something to release it. Neither of us understood, sitting in that coffee shop, why my name was still on it after everything, or what our parents had actually intended for it in the decades since they'd stopped speaking to me about anything at all. I called the insurance company myself the following Monday, curious enough now that curiosity had started to outweigh the discomfort of engaging with any connected to my parents. The representative confirmed what the document already suggested. The policy had been purchased when I was born, originally structured as a modest college fund vehicle, and had simply never been amended in the 34 years since. No beneficiary change forms had ever been filed. Whatever conversations my parents may have had with Sam about the policy being for him, legally, on paper, in the only place that actually mattered, it had remained entirely mine the whole time. The representative, a patient woman who walked me through the policy's full history over the phone, mentioned something else that caught my attention. A small automatic annual statement had been mailed to my parents' address every single year since the policy's creation, meaning someone in that house had received, and presumably opened, 34 consecutive years of paperwork confirming my ownership without ever once mentioning it to me, or apparently fully correcting whatever version of the story they'd been telling Sam. I sat with that detail a long time after I hung up, understanding that this hadn't been a case of genuinely forgetting a decades-old form. Someone had been actively choosing, year after year, not to deal with it honestly. Sam's reaction to that news, when I called to tell him, wasn't the relief I'd braced for. It was confusion, then something heavier. Mom told me, more than once, that the policy was set aside for me specifically because you'd left, and didn't need it anymore, he said, his voice tightening. She made it sound like you knew about it, and had basically signed off on giving it to me. I always thought that was, I don't know, one nice thing you'd done for me even after everything. I sat with that for a long moment, understanding, with a slow, cold clarity, that our mother hadn't simply forgotten to update paperwork. She'd told my brother a story about my supposed generosity that painted me as someone who'd left him behind on purpose, rather than the reverse. "I think I need a minute," Sam said, and I let the silence sit on the line between us, understanding exactly what kind of minute he needed. When he came back, his voice was different, quieter, working something out in real time. "All this time I thought you'd at least done one decent thing for me, even after cutting everyone else off. And it turns out you didn't even know it existed." I told him I was sorry he'd been given a version of me to hold on to that was never actually true, and that I understood now why he might have spent years feeling a strange, complicated gratitude towards someone who'd never actually earned it. at least not in the way he'd been told. The estate itself, once Sam and I started sorting through it together, turned out to be smaller and more precarious than either of us expected. A modest house with more debt against it than equity, a handful of accounts largely depleted by years of medical costs, probate proceedings already tangled and slow-moving. Sam's own disability benefits, I learned, had recently been thrown into uncertainty by our parents' deaths, with caregiver arrangements and paperwork that had always run through them now sitting in a kind of administrative limbo nobody had prepared him to navigate alone. Going through those files together, sitting on the floor of the same office my father used to disappear into for hours when I was a kid, felt strange in a way I hadn't fully braced for, not painful exactly, but disorienting, like walking through a museum built entirely out of a life I'd only ever seen from the outside for the past 2 decades. Sam handled most of the actual documents, more familiar with the recent ones than I was, while I found myself drawn instead to the older files, the ones that predated my departure, looking, I think, for some kind of evidence about who my parents had actually been before I'd stopped being able to see them clearly at all. Here's what I finally understood. Sitting with Sam in our father's old office going through file after file, my parents hadn't just failed me at 12 and then let that failure calcify into permanent distance. They'd apparently spent years afterward quietly rewriting the story of what happened, at least to Sam, in a way that let them avoid ever reckoning with it honestly, turning my absence into a choice I'd supposedly made against him, rather than the direct, foreseeable result of a choice they'd made against he first. The unfairness of that reframing sat heavier in my chest than almost anything else in that entire box of paperwork. Near the bottom of a different box, one Sam hadn't gotten to yet, I found a stack of letters in my mother's handwriting, addressed to me, dated across nearly 15 years, none of them ever sent. I sat on the floor of that office and read every single one. Some were angry, defensive, the kind of letter you write to convince yourself you were right rather than to actually communicate. Others, especially the later ones, were different, raw, guilty, admitting in her own words that she'd known, almost from that very drive home from my aunt's house, that she and my father had badly failed me, and that shame had kept her from ever picking up the phone to say so directly, choosing silence instead, year after year, until silence became simply how our family functioned by default. One letter, dated the year I turned 25, stopped me completely. I keep telling myself there will be a right time to call, and every year that passes makes the silence feel more impossible to break, not less. I don't know how to explain to you or to Sam that I was capable of loving both my children and still failing one of them so completely. I think some part of me decided it was easier to let you become the daughter who left than to admit I was the mother who let her go. I sat with that particular sentence a long time, understanding, for the first time, that my mother had at least seen the truth clearly at some point, even if she'd never once found the courage to say it to my face while she had the chance. I consulted an estate attorney the following week, a steady, unhurried man named Walter Odom, mostly to help Sam and me actually untangle the mechanics of the estate and his benefit situation rather than out of any interest in fighting over what little our parents have left behind. Walter reviewed everything: the insurance policy, the estate's debts, Sam's disability paperwork, and flagged something neither of us had noticed on our own. Our Uncle Ray, our father's younger brother, had apparently been serving as an informal financial helper for Sam's caregiver stipend account for the past several years, a role that had never been formalized, documented, or reviewed by anyone outside the family. Walter explained the situation carefully, aware, I think, of how much this particular piece of news might land given everything else Sam and I were already sorting through. Informal family arrangements like this aren't unusual, he said, and most of the time they're completely benign, a relative helping out, because it's easier than dealing with a formal institution. But informal also means there's rarely any built-in check on whether the money is actually being handled the way it should be. He asked whether either of us had ever seen a full accounting of the stipend account. Sam admitted he hadn't, that Ray had always just handled it, cheerfully, without either of our parents or Sam himself ever really asking to see the underlying numbers. Walter's review of Ray's handling of that account turned up irregularities significant enough to warrant a closer look. withdrawals that didn't clearly match Sam's actual care, expenses, a pattern of administrative fees. Ray had apparently been quietly deducting for himself without ever disclosing the practice to Sam, or, as far as either of us could tell, to our parents while they were alive. I thought about Ray at family gatherings years earlier, always warm, always the uncle who showed up with a joke and a card trick for Sam, and felt a specific disorienting kind of betrayal on my brother's behalf, layered right on top of my own much older version of the same feeling. Walter's forensic review, once he brought in a colleague to formalize it, showed a pattern spanning nearly 4 years. That struck me most, reviewing the numbers with Walter. It was the specific cruelty of it. Money quietly skimmed from an account meant to support a disabled young man who trusted the uncle managing it precisely because nobody had ever taught him he was allowed to ask for a full accounting in the first place. Sam and I confronted Ray together at his own kitchen table, Walter's findings printed and laid out plainly between us. Ray reached first for the same easy, deflecting warmth I remembered from childhood, waving off the discrepancies as just how these things get messy over the years, nothing anybody meant anything by. When I pushed evenly, asking him to explain the specific administrative fee pattern Walter had flagged, Ray's tone shifted sharper now, more familiar in a different, uglier way. "You're really going to come back into this family after 20 years and start pointing fingers, Ren? You were always the difficult one. This is exactly why you left in the first place." Sam, sitting beside me, went very still at that, and I watched something shift across his face, not quite anger yet, more like the specific careful recalculation of someone realizing a person he'd trusted his whole life might not deserve the benefit of the doubt he'd always automatically extended. "Uncle Ray," he said quietly, before I could respond myself, "I've never once heard Ren raise her voice this whole conversation. You're the one getting loud." It was a small observation, said plainly, without any real heat behind it, but it landed in that kitchen with more weight than almost anything I'd said myself, coming as it did from the one person in the room Ray had clearly expected to stay loyally on his side, no matter what the numbers showed. I sat with that sentence for a moment, feeling its old, practiced weight, the same kind of reframing my mother's unsent letters had shown me my parents had been quietly running for years. Then I said, calmly, the thing 12-year-old me standing in my aunt's driveway never had the standing or the words to say. I left because I was told, by our own father, that a 12-year-old should be able to find her own way home from a fair in the dark. I'm not the difficult one, Ray. I'm just the one who finally has the paperwork to prove it. Entire time, I want to be clear about something here. Nothing legally required me to share a dollar of that policy with Sam. I chose to once I understood the full corrected shape of our history, not out of guilt, and not to buy back 22 lost years, but because I finally had the facts straight enough to make that choice freely, rather than under the weight of a story someone else had written for me. Walter structured the trust carefully, with an independent corporate trustee overseeing disbursements and a clear written accounting requirement built directly into its terms, the exact kind of oversight that had been missing from Ray's informal arrangement from the very beginning. Sam sat in on every meeting as we set it up, asking careful, increasingly confident questions as the weeks went on, visibly settling into a role he'd apparently never been given the chance to occupy before, an active participant in decisions about his own care and finances rather than someone things were simply arranged around on his behalf. Watching him ask Walter, unprompted, exactly how often he'd be able to review the trust's statements going forward, I felt something close to pride, an emotion I hadn't expected to feel this early into rebuilding a relationship with a brother I'd barely known as an adult. Sam and I had one more real conversation before any of the paperwork finalized, sitting on his apartment balcony on an ordinary Tuesday evening, nothing formal about it at all. I told him, plainly, what had actually happened at that fair, the 6 hours, the unanswered calls, our father's exact words in that driveway. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long time, before saying, "I spent so many years thinking you just didn't want to be part of this family anymore. I'm sorry I never once asked you for the real story, instead of just believing the one I was handed." I told him he'd been a kid too, handed a story by the two adults he had every reason to trust. Neither of us needed to forgive our parents in that conversation. We just needed, finally, to agree on what had actually happened to both of us. We sat out there a long time after that, past sunset, the ordinary sounds of his neighborhood settling in around us. Someone's television through an open window, a dog barking a few units over, the specific, unremarkable texture of a regular evening that felt, after everything, almost startling in its normalcy. Sam asked, eventually, careful in the way he still sometimes was with harder questions, whether I thought our parents had loved us. I told him I thought they'd loved us as best they knew how, with whatever tools they'd been given themselves, and that loving someone imperfectly wasn't the same thing as not loving them at all, even though the damage it caused could be every bit as real either. He nodded slowly at that, turning it over, and said it was maybe the first answer about our family that had actually made sense to him in years. I don't know that I've fully forgiven my parents even now, and I stopped feeling like I owe anyone, including myself, a tidy timeline for whether I ever will. What I do know is that the 22 years of silence I kept were never really about punishing them, whatever Ray or the version of the story my mother told Sam might have implied. They were about protecting the one thing I'd learned, at 12, standing in a driveway, that nobody else was reliably going to protect for me. I understand now that protecting myself and eventually choosing to help my brother were never actually in conflict. They just had to happen in the right order, with the right facts in hand for me to be able to tell the difference. It's been a little over a month since that balcony conversation. Sam's trust is properly funded and independently overseen now, his caregiver arrangements finally stable and no longer running through anyone with an informal, undocumented thumb on the scale. We talk most weeks, careful still, rebuilding something neither of us had a real model for growing up, but honest in a way our family never quite managed while our parents were alive to shape the story. Last weekend, driving past a county fairground on the way to visit him, I felt the old memory rise the way it still sometimes does, sharp and immediate even after 2 decades. This time, though, I noticed something different sitting alongside it, not just the hurt of that night, but the fact that I'd eventually built an entire adult life steady enough to come back, on my own terms, and help fix what those 6 hours had first broken. Ellis asked me recently, gently, whether I regretted any of the last 22 years of silence, given everything I now understood. I told him I didn't, not really, because the version of me capable of walking into that estate attorney's office, reading my mother's unsent letters without falling apart, and calmly telling my uncle exactly why he was wrong, was a version of me that 22 years of hard-won independence had built, piece by piece, long before Sam's text ever arrived. I don't think the 12-year-old sitting on an overturned bucket at that fair could have survived what the last month required. I'm grateful, in a strange, complicated way, that the woman she eventually grew into could. That's my story. One insurance policy, one box of unsent letters, and a brother who finally got the true version of why his sister disappeared. If this reminded you that being told to grow up too fast doesn't mean you have to carry it alone forever, take that as your sign today. Share it with someone who's ever had to find their own way home. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.